Hello, welcome, welcome. So we're going to go through the slides for the resume. So the very first thing you will see is these accents. So this is how you actually spell the word resume. Every time I put it on Classroom, it's just going to look like the word resume because I don't want to do the accents every single time because that's a lot of extra work. But resume is what it's actually called. So you know. But let's start here. So like I said, resume is just an overview of your work experiences. One thing that I didn't mention so far is that you'll have references on your resume, which we'll talk a little bit more on a later slide about. But it's also, so you'll include like your contact info, you'll include your experiences, but you'll also include like, here are some people who will vouch for me, here are some people who will back me up and say that I'm a good candidate or a good worker or a good person for this position. Kind of like letters of recommendation. So it's an overview of why you would be a good candidate, I guess, is a better way to put a resume. One thing I want to note here is that it's probably not going to be enough to get you the job on its own. Like, that almost never happens. When you're applying for the job, the resume is not just going to be so fantastic that the employer's like, yes, gotta have them. But it can lose you the job on its own. I say this because the resume is usually the first step of filtering people out if you have a lot of people applying for a position. Like, if the resume looks messy, or if the resume doesn't have like good experience or good references or something on it, that can be a deal breaker right out of the gate, or a way to just kind of filter some people out of the pool of applicants. So it can lose you the job on its own, which is why I think this is it's an important thing to talk about and be able to write a good one. So moving on, before we move on to like all the other sections specifically. So general rule of thumb, well, less general, like a hard rule. Don't lie on your resume. It catches up to you. And we could go further in depth on that, but what I want you to take from this slide is that I don't want you to lie on your resume. Lying on your resume is generally a bad idea because that catches up with you, especially in a job interview. That being said, selling yourself and talking up your experiences is generally a good thing on the resume. Like, you want to be able to present your experiences in an appealing way that makes your resume look better. But you don't want to lie in order to do that. I think embellishing is kind of a gray area between those two things. Probably best to avoid that. But it's like, so let's say you worked at a gas station or something, and you were just like the cashier. Don't lie and say you were the manager because you think it looks better. However, you can sell that experience and talk it up by saying, like, instead of just saying I was the cashier there, you could talk about how like you were, I don't know, the forward-facing representative at that area, and you were like you dealt with customers, and here's some other things that you had to do throughout the day, and here's some other things that maybe you were in charge of doing. So being a bit more specific or a bit more descriptive can help you really sell your experiences, but without lying about them. So last thing I want to say here, if you're doing interview A, which is just the normal one, interview B is applying for my job. So if you're not doing that, you're doing interview A, where you choose whatever you're applying for. If you're doing that one, if you're interview A, you can add fake experience to this resume. Don't do this in real life, but for this resume, I'm okay with you adding some stuff. Like, let's say you're applying to be an astronaut. It's okay to include, like, say you went to college at a certain place, or like you worked at NASA for a few years. Because if you're just limited to saying like I am a freshman in high school, then it's gonna, like, you're not gonna get as much practice with like actual formatting stuff on the resume. So I'm okay if you add stuff for that one, but obviously don't do that on a real resume. Okay, contact info. So this one's pretty straightforward. You want it to look professional. So like I said, it doesn't need to be your real address or phone number for this assignment. You want to have your full first and last name, email. So the reason why Obi-Wan here is on the screen is a cautionary tale. So I put this up here so I can warn you to not do this. So don't do what my old high school debate partner did, which was send a bunch of college applications out listing his email as jackthejedi@hotmail.com. And there's worse email addresses to have. I've definitely gotten emails from students who have had worse email addresses, but those probably aren't good examples to share. So you want to have an email that is professional, or at the very least neutral sounding. And that might mean that, like, hey, you use your school email, or you create a Gmail that just is your name, and that will help your resume. Like, that can be something that can disqualify you early on if employers are looking for a way to cut down the field of applicants. So you want a professional sounding email. That might mean you have to make one. But anyway, educational experience. So the idea here, this is just the section at the right after the contact info where you're talking about, here's where I went to school, here's how long I went to school there, here's what I studied, and this is kind of how you would format it. It's okay to put your expected graduation date. There are a lot of jobs out there, especially jobs like right out of college, like teaching is a good example, where you're applying to those jobs while you're still in school. And so you can say, well, you're expected to graduate May of 2020 or something like that. But otherwise, it would just be like when you started at the place up through present date, or however long you were at that place. Let's see. Here, it's okay to include, like, if you have a class that's very relevant to the job you're applying for, like let's say you're applying to the outdoor campus or something like that, and you are taking, or you passed AP Environmental Science, that might be worth including, or like AP Biology, that might be worth including. And so you can make specific note of some experiences that you've had if they're very relevant and they help out a lot there. Other rule of thumb, don't go below or earlier than high school. Like, I say put high school and college and anything after that on here. Don't put like middle school on here, because employers generally don't care about that. Okay, work experience and skills and abilities. I'm going to tackle these two together. So this wonderful graphic is this is you taking an idea and running with it, because this section, along with the skills and abilities, is the section that I think can require you to use more creative language or expand more upon things that you've done and really talk up your experiences. So the work experience, I think you'll want to follow the stuff that's on the template and say, here's where I worked, here's how long I worked there, here's what the job title was, but then also, like, here's what I did, here's what my responsibilities were, and that can include stuff that, like, you were regularly expected to do this thing even though it wasn't part of your official job title or job description. So any responsibilities or tasks that you had regularly are worth including. And then I say this because actions tend to speak louder than words. Here is where you want to show your employer, here are things that I've been trusted with in the past that you can probably trust me with at this job. And so things that you have done, responsibilities that you have had, are pretty good to include here. Skills and abilities is where it's the same philosophy, but it's not necessarily part of a job. So there's probably some overlap with work experience, but here could be a good place to include any programs or skills, any apps that you have experience with that could be helpful. I know any of, like, the Google apps are really important things to have experience with, like, especially in education today with, like, remote learning and things like that. And so it kind of depends on what you're applying for, what you really want to emphasize here, but anything that you have experience with, whether it's a skill or a program or anything like that, could be good to include here. Last thing is the references. So a reference is just a person who's going to vouch for you and say you're reliable, that you would be a good candidate for a job. Don't include family members, because the idea is that they're expected to vouch for you, and so they generally don't have a whole lot of credibility on resumes. Anybody who works, or anybody who who you're accountable to, anybody who has some authority, like a teacher, a coach, a counselor, any past managers or bosses, are usually really good people to ask for references. They generally have a lot of credibility. But the last bit of advice is ask somebody before you use them as a reference. You want them to be ready if your employer is going to call them and say, hey, is so and so really good at the job or really good to work here? You want them to be able to be prepared and say as many good things about you as they can. So you want, as a courtesy, if nothing else, to let them know. But here's the formatting for that as well. Anyway, I want to keep this under 10 minutes. So that is the guide to the resume. Do as much as you can today.